lost a single battle in his entire life. Not one. The Persians fielded armies 5 times the size of his against him. The Indians unleashed live elephants on him, beasts his soldiers had never even seen before. Fate laid trap after trap for him, and time after time he emerged victorious. And he died at 32. Not from a sword, not from a spear, but from a fever, in a foreign city, in a foreign land. A few years after his death, they killed his mother, killed his sister, killed his wife and his little son, everyone in whom his blood ran. The empire for which he had given half his life fell apart faster than he had managed to build it. How did a boy who, in Persia, wasn't even initially considered a serious threat, just some bandit from the mountainous fringe of the Greek world, destroy in 10 years a state where 5 times more people lived than in all of Greece? Why did a man with such intelligence and such power leave no will and name no heir, as if he simply had no time for it? Is it true that he killed with his own hands a friend who had once saved his life in battle? And where does the body actually lie? The body that was buried 3 times, and whose grave people are still searching for more than 2,000 years later. Let's not start with his birth. Let's start with the day when no one yet suspected that before them stood the future ruler of half the world, the palace in Pella, the capital of Macedonia. A delegation from Persia has arrived to see King Philip. From a power that at that moment stretched from Egypt to India and was home to as many as 20 million people, while all of Greece, together with Macedonia, numbered barely 5 million. A huge delegation, representatives of the most powerful country on the planet. But the king is away. He's traveling. In his place, an 8-year-old boy receives the envoys, and this boy doesn't ask about wonders, not about hanging gardens, not about the gold of Persian palaces. He asks about roads, about how many days the journey takes from the capital to the border, about the structure of the Persian army, about the character of their king. The Persian envoys, who in their time had seen dozens of royal courts, exchange astonished glances. This child is conducting the conversation like a scout, not like a prince put on display. Of course, some advisor probably whispered these questions to him beforehand, but the fact remains, an 8-year-old boy knew how to hold a pause and listen in a way that made grown men feel uneasy. What kind of man would this boy have to grow into to wipe off the map 24 years later, the very state whose envoys he had politely questioned at the children's table? His mother's name was Olympias. Now, there was a character, a princess from the neighboring mountain kingdom of Epirus, one of Philip's 7 wives. The marriage was, as usual, a purely political deal. No love ever developed between the spouses, but hostility developed from the very start and lasted a lifetime. Olympias did not run the household and did not sit quietly in the women's quarters of the palace, as was expected of a Greek wife. She wove intrigues, gathered allies, nursed grudges, and methodically sowed discord between husband and son. Because the less the father trusted the son, the tighter the mother's grip on him became. And from early childhood, she instilled in Alexander one simple idea: you are not just the son of a king, you are the son of someone greater. Later, as a famous general, Alexander apparently believed this in earnest. His father, Philip II, was no pushover either. He came to the throne almost by accident, after the deaths of his 2 older brothers, and turned a small, largely unremarkable mountain kingdom into the strongest military power in the Greek world. It was Philip who invented the Macedonian phalanx, a dense formation of infantry, armed with spears of incredible length, 5.5 meters, twice as long as ordinary Greek spears. Imagine going into battle when your weapon is longer than a room in an average apartment. It was Philip who taught cavalry and infantry to act together, rapidly shifting forces to wherever the outcome of the battle was being decided. The son would take this ready-made war machine and bring it to perfection. But the father built the machine itself, and Alexander never forgot that, whatever flatterers at his court later said. We know his appearance only from descriptions written by people who lived centuries after his death, and of course never saw him. Of average height, fair-haired, fair-skinned, his skin easily reddened in the sun. All biographers noted two distinctive features: eyes of different colors and a slight tilt of the head to the left, possibly a consequence of scoliosis rather than the regal contemplativeness that sculptors later depicted. He didn't care for athletic competitions, preferring hunting and music, which is why in his youth he tended toward plumpness, and that fits rather amusingly with the fact that statues would later be made of him, as if he were an Olympian god. His character was an explosive mix of his father's calculation and his mother's temper. Over the years, he would become suspicious, would suffer mood swings, would swing between rage and melancholy. A familiar picture for many people who have reached absolute power, from Roman emperors to czars of much later eras. His first teacher was a distant relative of his mother's, named Leonidas, a stern man whose main task was the boy's physical training. He put him through brutal drills, devised trial after trial, and it must be admitted, all of this proved very useful to Alexander later in his endless campaigns through mountains and deserts. The next tutor was Lysimachus, who taught reading, writing, and music. But the third teacher truly changed the boy's destiny. When Alexander was 13, Philip hired for his son the greatest philosopher of the age, Aristotle himself, warning him in advance that his pupil was stubborn and quick-tempered. A special school was built for the lessons not far from the capital, in the town of Mysa, away from the palace intrigues, where the young prince's peers also studied. Future generals, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Hephaestion, and others. People who would grow up with him, follow him to the ends of the earth, and then, after his death, tear his own empire apart. But more on that later. Aristotle taught him medicine, geometry, astronomy, and politics, and instilled in him a love of reading. All his life, Alexander would carry with him a copy of the Iliad, annotated by his teacher, and at night he would place it under his pillow next to his dagger. And there's a portrait of the man in two objects: a heroic epic about war and glory, and a readiness to kill. In one of his works, Aristotle wrote that the Greek people, standing as it were between north and east, had absorbed the best qualities of both sides and were therefore capable of ruling over everyone, if only they could be united under a single power. Alexander remembered this idea and put it into practice more than once, though, to the great misfortune of the peoples, he united by force. There is another story connected with his education that became legend even during his lifetime. When he was 12, a horse was brought to the court, extraordinarily strong, wild, untamable, for which an enormous sum was being asked. No one could master the beast, and Philip was already about to give up on the purchase when the boy noticed something. The adults had missed. The horse was frightened of its own shadow. Alexander turned it to face the sun, spoke to it quietly, stroked it, and within a minute was calmly riding it before the astonished court. His father, according to legend, said, "My son, seek yourself a kingdom equal to your abilities, Macedonia is too small for you. The horse was named Bucephalus, meaning ox head, and this animal would become Alexander's only truly loyal companion for decades to come, through every campaign, all the way to India. At 16 came his first real test of power. Philip went off on campaign, leaving his son as regent, to govern the country in his absence. And almost immediately, on the northern border, the Thracian tribe of the Maedi rebelled, deciding that power had weakened in the hands of a teenager. Alexander didn't wait for help. He gathered troops, crushed the rebels with such resolve that no one wanted to try again, and on the site of the former enemy lands, founded a new settlement, naming it after himself, Alexandropolis, the first of dozens of cities he would later scatter across Asia. At 16. At that age, people nowadays are still just deciding where to apply to college. At 18 came his first great battle, at Chaeronea in 338 BC, against the combined army of Athens and Thebes, the two strongest Greek states. Philip commanded the right flank, while the left, not an honorary post for show, but a real combat assignment, was entrusted to his son. Facing Alexander stood the Theban Sacred Band, 300 elite warriors who had never before known defeat. And Alexander didn't just defeat them. He annihilated the unit completely, down to the last man, and then broke through the entire Greek flank. After this victory, all of Greece, except unbending Sparta, came under Macedonian control. And a year later, everything went sideways. Philip married for the 7th time to a young Macedonian noblewoman, Cleopatra. And at the wedding feast, her uncle, a nobleman named Attalus, raised his cup and loudly wished the newlyweds a legitimate Macedonian heir. A transparent hint, Alexander's mother was from Epirus, meaning Alexander himself was half foreign. The 18-year-old victor of Chaeronea, enraged, threw his cup at Attalus's face and shouted, "So what am I then?" Drunk, Philip grabbed his sword and lunged at his son, and stumbling, fell to the floor. Alexander looked at his father lying before him and delivered a line still considered one of the most cutting in history. Here is a man preparing to conquer Asia, and he can't even make it from one couch to another, and he left for exile along with his mother. Father and son were later reconciled, but the closeness that had existed before was never restored. And a year after that, Philip was murdered. During the wedding celebrations of his own daughter, he walked out into the theatre arena without a bodyguard, in a white cloak, and one of his own bodyguards struck him with a dagger straight to the chest. Historians still argue about who was behind the murder, whether it was the bodyguard's personal revenge, a conspiracy, or a version not easily dismissed, the involvement of Olympias herself, or perhaps even Alexander. No one has direct proof. What is known is that a few days after the murder, Olympias placed a golden wreath on the head of the executed killer, whose body had been put on public display. Such were the times. Alexander is 20. An assembly of Macedonian soldiers proclaims him king. And the first thing he does is eliminate everyone who could theoretically claim the throne. Cleopatra, Philip's young widow, is killed along with her infant. A cousin is killed. Several more relatives whose lineage gave them any claim to power are killed. The 20-year-old pupil of Aristotle, admirer of Homer, coldly slaughters his own kin, because in the struggle for the throne, this was the only way to survive. This was considered normal. Next, the Greek cities, learning of the death of the formidable Philip, immediately rise up in revolt, deciding the young heir wouldn't be able to hold power. Alexander marches through all of Greece with lightning speed, and within a few months achieves recognition as the military head of the Hellenic League, hegemon, as the supreme commander of the coalition of Greek states was called. It is at that time, in Corinth, that the famous meeting takes place with the philosopher Diogenes, who lived nearby in an enormous clay grain jar. Later, in legend, this vessel would become a barrel. Philosophers, poets, and influential people from across Greece flock to the young king, who is already simultaneously worshipped and feared, to pay their respects. Only one man does not come. Diogenes. Alexander, stung by this, goes to him himself, positions himself so that his shadow falls right across the old man and asks, "Ask me for anything you desire." Diogenes, without rising from the ground, replies, "Step aside, you're blocking my sun." His retinue freezes. Surely the king will fly into a rage now. But Alexander instead turns to his companions and says, "If I weren't Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes," a strange fondness for the one person in his life who wanted nothing from him. Then comes the campaign against the northern neighbors, the Illyrians and Thracians, where Alexander for the first time stays away from home for so long. And naturally, rumors of his death immediately begin to spread. They were spread especially eagerly by the Athenian politician Demosthenes, who once again urged the Greeks to rebel and call on the Persians for help. Learning of this, Alexander crosses the Balkan mountain range in 2 weeks, a speed unthinkable for that era, and storms the perpetually restless city of Thebes. This time, there are no negotiations. More than 6,000 people died. Another 30,000 were sold into slavery. The city was wiped off the map, leaving only a fortress with a Macedonian garrison and the house of the poet Pindar. Alexander still respected poetry, even in the midst of slaughter. Such were the times. After this, the other Greek cities fell silent for a long while, not out of love, but out of fear. Before setting off against his main enemy, Alexander, following tradition, visits the Delphic oracle, the most revered place of prophecy in the entire Greek world. The priestess refuses to prophesy on an unfavorable day, and the young king, unaccustomed to hearing no, literally drags her by force to the temple. In despair, the woman exclaims, "You are invincible, my son." Alexander lets her go, saying that this prophecy is enough for him. It's probably a legend, but it perfectly illustrates the main principle of this man: to hear exactly what you need to hear, and to keep moving forward without looking back. In the spring of 334 BC, the Greek army under Alexander's command crosses the Dardanelles, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. About 40,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry travel by ship, most of them Macedonians, plus a large detachment of engineers, mechanics, and cartographers. In his retinue are 2 writers whose task is to record the general's exploits for posterity, essentially the first war correspondence in history. Alexander has almost no money, and provisions will last at most a month. Contemporaries write about this directly. This is precisely why his army would move so swiftly. Stopping would mean starvation. They land near legendary Troy, a site of ancient Greek military glory. And this is no accident, but a calculation. At this time of year, the Persian fleet is at its winter anchorage and cannot interfere with the landing. The first major battle takes place on the river Granicus, in what is now Turkey. The Persians hold the high bank. The position looks impregnable. Advisors unanimously urge Alexander against attacking, calling it suicide. But he understands. To retreat now would mean losing the army's trust before the campaign has even begun. At dawn, the troops cross the river and engage on equal terms. At one point, Alexander himself nearly dies. He's saved by the commander of his bodyguards, a childhood friend named Clytus, nicknamed the Black. Remember this moment. We'll come back to it, and it will be one of the most difficult scenes in Alexander's entire story. The Persian cavalry is overturned. The Greek mercenary infantry fighting on the enemy's side is almost completely destroyed without any mercy. Traitors were shown none. Alexander's losses are just over 30 men. The Persians, around 2,500. The Greek cities of Asia Minor open their gates to him, welcoming him as a liberator from Persian tribute. Alexander does indeed free them from the old taxes to Persia, and immediately introduces a new one, his own, a victor's tax. Essentially the same tribute, only now it funds the continuation of the campaign. Freedom is a relative concept when your liberator is supporting his army at your expense. Not all cities surrender without a fight. Miletus and Halicarnassus put up fierce resistance, and only Greek siege engines breaching the walls decide the outcome. The next city on his path is Gordium, and here is born an expression that would outlive the Persian Empire itself by thousands of years. In a temple there stands an ancient war chariot, to which a yoke is tied with an extraordinarily intricate knot, the ends of the knot hidden so that it's impossible to untie. Legend has it that whoever unties this knot will become ruler of the entire world. Alexander tries and fails. Then he draws his sword and cuts the knot with a single blow. Since then, cutting the Gordian knot has meant solving an unsolvable problem by the most radical means. Plutarch, however, adds a less romantic version. In fact, Alexander simply pulled out a hidden metal pin that held the yoke in place. Not much of a legend, but it perfectly characterizes the man. If a problem couldn't be solved the normal way, he changed the conditions of the problem itself. By this point, the Persian king Darius III finally grasps the scale of the threat. He personally assembles an army and meets Alexander near the city of Issus in November 333 BC. The Persians, by various estimates, outnumber the Greeks 2 or 3 to 1. But the battlefield is narrow, squeezed between the sea and the mountains, and this nearly nullifies the Persian advantage. Alexander again breaks through into the thick of the fighting toward Darius's chariot, and Darius flees. He abandons his army, abandons his camp with its treasures, abandons his mother, wife, and children. He shamefully casts off his royal regalia so as not to be recognized as he flees. Immense treasures fall into Alexander's hands: 3,000 talents, about 78 tons of silver, along with the entire family of the Persian king. Plutarch, with clear delight, describes how Alexander examines vessels of pure gold, breathes in the scent of incense in the tent, astonished by its size and luxury, and says to his friends, "This, it seems, is what it means to be a king." Macedonia, it should be noted, had been a rather harsh land. Such luxury had never been seen there. Alexander did not harm Darius's captive family and treated them royally, not out of mercy, but out of cold calculation. From the very start, he was building the image not of a barbarian conqueror, but of the legitimate successor to the Persian throne. Having defeated Darius at Issus, he had captured only the western part of his realm. To crush the entire empire, this was not enough, and Darius himself was already assembling a new army in the eastern provinces. Alexander decides not to pursue him for now, but to secure his rear and turn south along the coast of Phoenicia and Syria. Byblos and Sidon surrender easily, but the wealthiest city of Phoenicia, Tyre, standing on an impregnable island, refuses to let him in. And one of the most stubborn sieges in history begins. For 7 months, the Greeks build an artificial causeway nearly 800 meters long to connect the island to the mainland, move siege engines across it, and finally break into the city. The slaughter is terrible. Nearly 7,000 killed, 20,000 sold into slavery. Tyre would later be rebuilt, but nothing of the ancient legendary city would remain in it. While Alexander was besieging Tyre, Darius sent a peace delegation to him. He offered to hand over the entire western part of the empire, which he had already lost anyway, to give his daughter in marriage to Alexander, and to pay an unprecedented ransom, 30,000 talents, 10 times what the Greeks had taken after the Battle of Issus. Any of Alexander's advisors in his place would have said, "Agree immediately." Alexander does not agree at all. He replies to Darius with a famous line, "Do not write to me as an equal. Everything you possess is now mine. If you want to fight for your throne, fight, don't run." After Tyre, Gaza, where Alexander is wounded but still takes the city, and then, without resistance, he takes Egypt. The Persian governor surrenders the country immediately because the Egyptians hate their former masters and greet the Macedonians as liberators. Here, Alexander makes one of the smartest political moves of his life. He is proclaimed pharaoh. It doesn't matter that he isn't Egyptian and doesn't know the local gods. For the Egyptians, only one thing matters, that he is willing to defend their country and respect their traditions. A new title is added to his name, son of the god Ra and beloved of Amun. And from about this point on, Alexander begins to call himself, modestly, the son of the god Zeus, the Greek equivalent of the very same Amun. Apparently, he really did believe this. He undertakes an exhausting trek across the desert to the oracle of the god Amun in the Siwa oasis. The sanctuary lost a week's journey from the nearest town. What the priest said to him there, he never told anyone, ever. But after this visit, a strange nickname would stick to him in the East, the two-horned one, most likely because of a helmet with 2 horns that referenced the ram, the sacred animal of Amun. Here too, having sailed up the Nile to the Mediterranean coast, the newly minted pharaoh founds a city and names it after himself, Alexandria of Egypt. He was told the location was poor, that the harbor would silt up. He insisted on his own way. Before long, one of the 7 wonders of the world would appear in this city, a 50-meter lighthouse, and one of the great libraries of the ancient world, a center of science and culture for centuries to come. In April 331 BC, Alexander leaves Egypt for good and moves toward the heart of the Persian state, toward the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, toward the great and enigmatic city of Babylon. Darius has already gathered a new army. Sources cite utterly implausible figures, up to 1 million men, which, of course, was physically impossible. But even by the most conservative estimates of historians, the Persians outnumbered the Greeks several times over, about 200,000 infantry and 35,000 cavalry against Alexander's 40,000 foot soldiers and 7,000 horsemen. Alexander's most experienced general, Parmenion, suggests striking at night, taking advantage of the numerical superiority under cover of darkness. Alexander refuses. "I do not steal my victory," and he calmly sleeps through the entire night in his tent. Take a second to consider what kind of man this must be. Before a battle where the enemy outnumbers him 5 to 1, he simply lies down and sleeps, only so that in the morning, in broad daylight, everyone would see him crush them. The Battle of Gaugamela, near a village whose name translates roughly as Camel's House, takes place on the 1st of October, 331 BC. The Persians strike at the center, where Darius himself is positioned. The attack falters. Alexander swiftly shifts forces to the flanks, blocks the enemy cavalry, and launches a powerful counterattack. As at Issus, the Persian army scatters, and running ahead of everyone is Darius himself. For the second time in a row, he abandons his army and his empire, this time for good. The army awards Alexander a new title, King of Asia. The Macedonians enter Babylon without a fight, then move on to Susa and Persepolis, two more capitals of the Persian state. In Susa, Alexander demonstratively sits on Darius's throne, fully aware of the insult this deals to the still living king. In the royal palace of Persepolis, they discover riches that contemporaries don't even dare estimate precisely. Witnesses spoke of 120,000 talents, while later researchers cautiously named a figure of around 200,000 talents. More than 5,000 tons of silver. Moving this wealth required 10,000 wagons and 5,000 camels. And that's just the pure silver. There were also lands, slaves, jewels, fabrics, works of art, siege engines, and who knows what else. It is precisely in Persepolis that an episode occurs which best shows how a military leader was before everyone's eyes, turning into an Eastern despot. Alexander orders the palace of the Achaemenids burned. The fire spreads to the entire city. Historians still cannot say for certain why, whether it was a drunken whim at a feast or calculated revenge for the Greek shrines burned by the Persians a century and a half earlier. But the fact remains, a man who had carefully cultivated the image of the legitimate heir to the Persian throne destroyed its main shrine with his own hands. Darius, meanwhile, keeps fleeing further east, and there he is killed by his own subordinates, hoping to earn the victor's forgiveness. Alexander finds his enemy's body, orders the conspirators punished, and buries the former king of kings with full royal honors. This is pure politics. Having killed the empire, he buries its last ruler as if he were a relative, and thereby tells everyone around him, I am the legitimate successor. The next several years are the most grueling part of the campaign. The mountainous lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, territory that today makes up Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. Here there are no beautiful battles, no brilliant victories, only a drawn-out guerrilla war in which the local tribes want neither the Persians nor the Macedonians, nor anyone at all. It is here that Alexander takes as his wife the local princess Roxana, who struck him at a feast after the capture of one of the mountain fortresses. This is, perhaps, his only marriage even partly born of feeling rather than calculation, though there is political meaning in it too. By marrying into the local nobility, Alexander makes it part of his system of power. It is Roxana who will bear him his only son and heir, whose fate we will still learn. And, getting ahead of myself, I'll say right away, it will be a very sad story. And now, the moment I promised you earlier. Clytus, nicknamed the Black, the man who saved Alexander's life back in the very first battle at the Granicus, an old friend, comrade in arms, a veteran who had served Philip too. A feast in Samarkand, well past midnight, everyone drunk. One of the flatterers begins praising Alexander's exploits while belittling the late Philip. They say the son achieved what the father never even dreamed of. Clytus explodes. He shouts that without his father's army and his father's victories, Alexander himself would be nobody, that the victories at Granicus and Gaugamela were the blood of ordinary Macedonians, not the favor of some so-called son of a moon, that the king was betraying his own people, surrounding himself more and more with Persian flatterers and forcing free men to prostrate themselves before him like before an Eastern despot. Alexander flies into a rage. Words are exchanged. He snatches a spear from one of the guards and throws it at Clytus. Clytus falls dead. And in that same instant, the drunkenness leaves Alexander completely. He pulls the spear from his friend's body and tries to strike himself with it. He's barely restrained in time. For 3 days, he doesn't get out of bed, doesn't eat, doesn't drink, calls out his dead friend's name. A man who had once saved his life in battle died at his own hand, simply because someone couldn't hold their tongue at a drunken feast. And this, perhaps, is the most terrible scene in his entire story. More terrible than all the battles and all the burned cities, because here there is no politics at all. Here there is only a man who lost control of himself and can no longer fix anything. After Sogdiana, ahead lies India, the edge of the world, beyond which the ancient Greeks knew almost nothing, imagining it as either a peninsula squeezed between mountains and ocean, or the very edge of the earth. In the spring of 327 BC, Alexander again crosses a mountain range and invades northwestern India, the basin of the Indus River. Local rulers surrender without a fight, one after another, until the Greeks reach the domain of King Porus, a man of gigantic stature and immense strength. Porus decides to give battle on the bank of the river Hydaspes, a tributary of the Indus, and fields 30,000 infantry, several thousand cavalry, and most importantly, war elephants, animals the Macedonians had previously seen only in travelers' tales. An elephant's hide could not be pierced by the arrows or javelins of the time, and the elephant's first charge literally trampled part of the Greek infantry. But as before, the outcome of the battle was decided by the cavalry. The horsemen broke the enemy infantry, war chariots wounded the elephants, and the animals, maddened with pain, turned and began trampling their own army. Chaos and panic spread through the Indian ranks. Porus suffers a crushing defeat, but fights bravely to the last. Alexander respects military valor. He spares Porus's life and even returns his throne to him, adding new lands. This was Alexander's last great battle, though no one knew it at the time. Around this same time, Bucephalus dies of old age, Alexander's only truly loyal companion, the horse he had tamed as a 12-year-old boy, which had gone through every campaign with him. Alexander is so shaken by this loss that he founds a city on the site of the horse's death and names it in his honor. Imagine that, naming an entire city after a horse. This city, incidentally, has survived to this day. It stands in modern-day Pakistan. From here, things only get harder. The Indian climate is utterly alien to the Greeks. Heat, the monsoon season, rivers overflowing their banks. Ahead looms a new grand war against the powerful Indian state of Nanda, whose army, according to rumor, numbers in the hundreds of thousands, with thousands of elephants. Over 8 years of campaigning, the Macedonian soldiers had marched, just imagine, 30,000 kilometers. That's like walking from Moscow to St. Petersburg 70 times over, except that these weren't tourists, but an army that, over this entire distance, was also constantly fighting. And on the bank of the river Hydaspes in the Punjab, a council of generals is held. One of the commanders, named Quinas, says out loud what no one before him had dared to say. A man who always achieves success must, above all, know when to stop. Interestingly, soon after this council, Quinas suddenly falls ill and dies. There is no proof of foul play, but you have to admit, it's the kind of coincidence that leaves an uneasy chill. The army does indeed turn back. Take a moment to consider. The man who had crushed the greatest empire in the world could not force his own soldiers to make one more march. The great campaign ends not in victory, but in a mutiny of his own men. On the way back, Alexander passes through the first capital of the Persians and, according to legend, visits the plundered tomb of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian state, who had died 200 years before these events. Before him stands a desecrated shrine. He orders the guardians punished and the tomb restored, a gesture of respect for the man whose place he now occupies. And incidentally, the structure itself has survived to this day. In Susa, Alexander sets about organizing the administration of his vast empire. First, he accuses several satraps, provincial governors whom he himself had recently appointed, of abuses of power and has them executed. He suppresses uprisings on the fringes. The army with which he had once set out from Greece has, by this point, almost ceased to exist. He declares a mobilization, recruits about 30,000 Persian youths, enrolls the best of them into his personal guard, brings Persians into military and political leadership. In essence, he is trying to assemble a single nation literally out of whatever parts are at hand. In 324 BC, he arranges a mass wedding of Greek nobility and Persian aristocratic women. 90 couples marry, among them the commander himself, who takes 2 Persian princesses as wives at once, even though he is already married to Roxana. The Macedonian veterans, who had spilled their blood for 10 years in the war against the Persians, watch this rapprochement with the recent enemy in horror. Plutarch recorded their words. The king had wrung out of these men everything they had to give, and now was casting them aside in disgrace, since he now had these young milksops with whom he intended to conquer the world. In response, Alexander does in fact release more than 10,000 veterans to go home. He is building a new world, and he no longer needs the old one for it. In Babylon, the commander launches grand preparations for a new campaign, this time against the Arabian Peninsula, and afterward, possibly further west as well. Ambition, as always, outruns reality, and at the end of May 323 BC, Alexander suddenly falls ill with a fever. The illness develops rapidly. He will live another 10 days and die in the palace of the legendary Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. He was 32 years old. People nowadays at this age are still deciding whether to go to a bar tonight, while this man, at 32, had already conquered territory that today makes up 18 independent states. According to legend, before his death, Alexander manages to say, "Over my body, a great strife will begin." And he is right. He understood perfectly well that he was leaving behind a vast empire with no single heir and no stable system of power. When would he have had time for politics, having spent his entire life at the front? Many of his contemporaries suspected poisoning by his own comrades, who feared for their own lives. Today, historians lean toward the idea that it was typhoid or malaria, but there is no exact answer, and there never will be. You can be undefeated through 10 years of continuous war and not survive a fever. Immediately after his death, a brutal struggle begins for the enormous inheritance. Alexander's surviving generals, those very childhood friends from Aristotle's school, would go down in history as the Diadochi, the successors. This war would last more than 20 years and claim the lives of almost everyone connected to him by blood. His mother Olympias would perish, His sister would perish. His wife Roxana would perish. His little son Alexander would perish, poisoned as a teenager, once he became too dangerous as a living symbol of legitimate power. The entire family of the man who had united half the known world would end up destroyed by people who had sworn him loyalty. Alexander's body, too, became an object of fierce contention. He had not managed to leave any instructions regarding his own burial, and his successors argued over where to bury him. In Babylon, in Egypt, he was, after all, Pharaoh, or in his native Macedonia. As usually happens, the strongest made the decision. Ptolemy intercepted the funeral procession and buried the body in Memphis, the very place where Alexander had first been proclaimed a god. Later, the sarcophagus was moved to Alexandria, where for centuries the greatest people of their age came to pay their respects, including Julius Caesar and the Emperor Augustus. There is a legend that Augustus accidentally broke off the nose of the remains. How you can do that accidentally is unclear, but a legend is a legend. Over the centuries, the trail of the grave is lost entirely. Today, the burial place of one of the most famous people in history remains one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. After his death, the enormous empire proved simply unviable. It broke apart into several states, ruled by the Diadochi and their descendants. Macedonia under a new dynasty, the Seleucid kingdom in the Near East, and Egypt under the rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty. It is from this very family that 2.5 centuries later, one of the most striking women of antiquity would emerge, Cleopatra. All these states existed for several centuries, and then, one after another, became part of the Roman Empire. But the mark left by this man proved far more durable than his own state. In just 10 years, Alexander's armies conquered the Persian Empire and northwestern India, increasing the territory of their conquests almost 20-fold to more than 5 million square kilometers, the largest empire of the ancient world, spanning 3 continents at once. The Greek language became an international language through which different peoples carried out cultural and commercial exchange with one another. The cities founded by Alexander, dozens of Alexandrias scattered from Egypt to Central Asia, became multinational cultural centers, many of which still exist today. He was the first in history to attempt to realize a grand geopolitical idea, to unite Europe and Asia, Greeks and Persians, into a single whole. The empire fell apart almost immediately after his death, but the model of a strong, centralized state capable of uniting different peoples across different continents outlived him by centuries and would in many ways become a model for the Roman Empire, which would learn from most of his mistakes. Alexander's campaigns literally destroyed the political barriers between West and East. New trade links grew on this ground, with an India previously unknown to the Greeks, and then with China as well. And just 2 centuries later, the Great Silk Road would pass along these very same routes, forever connecting Europe and Asia. Who was he? A genius or a madman? A builder or a destroyer? There is no answer, because he was both at once. He could spend hours poring over the Iliad before sleep, and a few days later kill his best friend in a fit of drunken rage. He could spare a defiant philosopher who wanted nothing from him and wipe an entire city off the face of the earth over a mere suspicion of betrayal. He believed he was the son of a god and died of an ordinary fever at 32 without ever managing to name his own heir. One of his earliest biographers admitted honestly, "I record more about him than I myself believe." And in this, perhaps, lies the whole secret of Alexander. Too much of what is told about him sounds too good to be entirely true, and too much of what remains after him is too real to be invention. Perhaps the wisest person in this whole story turned out to be the one who asked nothing of him, Diogenes, who wanted only one thing, for no one to block his sun. But history is not written by those who bask in the sun. History is written by those who march forward, not knowing when to stop, even if it costs them their life.